Well, welcome everyone. My name is Scott Hawbaker. I'm the Executive Director of NACAA and glad you could join us today. Today's webinar is entitled Invasive Pests, Past, Present, and Future. And with us we have David Coyle, who is an assistant professor with Forest Health and Invasive Species at Clemson. We're glad to have David with us, and I think I know we're a few housekeeping items. I'll just let you know that as you noticed, we are recording this, and I will plan to download that as soon as I get a copy of it, and we'll put it up on our YouTube site, and I'll send a link out. We'll also ask that following the meeting, probably at the same time I send that YouTube link out, we'll have an evaluation. It's a really short, just a few questions, just so that we can give some feedback to David, as well as for the committee to use for future webinars. So please look for that in your inbox. And at this time, I'll hand it over to David.
All right, thanks, Scott. Hello, everyone. My name is, as he said, Dave Coyle. I am the state specialist for forest health and invasive species with South Carolina. I'm at Clemson University. So today we're going to talk about invasive species. I hope that doesn't surprise any of you, but yeah, we'll talk about sort of, the basics of what makes an invasive species, how they get around, but then also how the county extension agents in particular can help, with all of our management and identification efforts, of which there are many of these things across the country. So before, I guess, if you have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat box and we'll handle those at the end. So here's how you reach me. Before we start, a little disclaimer. I'm going to give you quite a bit of fact-based information, but I do have some opinions, and unfortunately you are subject to them, and I will let you know when we are using opinions and when I have fact. So with that said, let's dive into terms. There's a lot of invasive species terms, unfortunately. And so we start with native. A native species simply means it is from here, right? Here, I tend to think of on the continental scale. I think if you look at it from a state perspective or just a country perspective, it can get tricky, especially along the borders. An example is if there's an insect that's from Canada and it just walks a few feet over into Minnesota, does that mean it invaded, or did it just simply expand its range, or just move even? So I kind of look at, when things go continent to continent is how I tend to think of invasive species. And so before you even get to invasive, there's three things that basically mean the same thing. Non-native species, exotic species, and alien species all just mean it's not from here. And again, here being this continent. Invasive ones have they're something that's not from here. They're also a species that causes lots of economic or ecological damage, and displacing native species, or just simply pushing them out of the way, is one of the main things. So all invasives are non-natives, but not all non-natives are invasive. That's a way to think about it. There's a lot of stuff, a lot of species, plants, insects, yada, yada, that are not from this continent, that are in this continent, that you've probably never heard of because they don't really do anything. They might not really survive. They might just sort of fade into the background and become part of the community. The invasive ones are the ones that are causing lots of damage. There's a pretty good paper in the Journal of Extension that deals with this very thing. They kind of talk about some of these things we just talked about. This is it just came out this year. So this is a really good one I recommend, and I'm happy to give these slides to everyone when we're done. I can send a PDF over. So why do we have so many invasive, right? They tend to dominate the news. They tend to dominate a lot of what we do. It all gets down to global trade, really, right? Because we import trillions of dollars in goods into this country every single year. And if you look on this map, the bigger the arrow, the more stuff that moves. And if the arrow is green, that means stuff is going out, right? So we look at our two big green arrows here, we are sending tons of stuff to Canada and to Mexico. If it's red, it means it's coming in. And if you look at that big red arrow coming in, you can see most of it is coming from, shocking no one, China, right? We We bring lots and lots and lots of stuff from China all the time. Now, that is one aspect of it, right? That's the trade aspect, but then there's the more biological things too, and also the abiotic. If you look at a world climate map, those climates kind of go across, right? So you've got areas in the States that are the same climate as areas over in Asia. And, you know, as you kind of move down, you get that temperate, and then you get that subtropical. Even going out west, where you've got a more dry climate, that's, you know, that type of climate is more akin to some of the, you know, Saudi Arabia and some of the Mediterranean areas as well. So you've got a very similar climate in different parts of the world. Forest vegetation zones too. I'm going to focus a bit on some of the forest species since that's what I work on. You've got the same thing. You've got this area in the southeast, this subtropical, warm, temperate, moist forest. And then you've got that same thing over in southern China. As you move up the coast, you've got the same thing. And even over here, coming into Canada in the northern part of the country, that matches, you know, a lot of Europe. This just simply means that, for instance, if there's a lot of oak species in the, you know, in our forests, there's a lot of oak species in those other temperate mixed forests. It might not be white oak, might not be red oak, it might be something else, but it's similar, right? And so that just simply means that when stuff comes over here on trade, on some sort of shipment, it finds a very similar climate, right? It finds similar temperature, similar humidity a lot of the times, and then it finds a very similar host plants. But what it doesn't have is that biotic component of things that eat it and things that control it, whether it's a grazer on a plant or some sort of parasitoid on some of the insects. When these things come over from, you know, off in Asia, they get out here and they're just basically turned loose, and it kind of feels like home. There's similar stuff to eat, but there's nothing trying to eat them. So with that, how do they get here, right? I think most of the stuff, especially the insects and fungi, are going to get here accidentally, shipping, right? In a few cases, sure, we have brought biocontrol agents over and that has gone awry. But in most cases, a lot of the non-native and the invasive insects and fungi we have come from shipped materials. And I mean, we have so many shipping crates coming in every single day into a lot of these ports. It is simply unfeasible and impossible to consider that you would even be able to inspect every single one of these, right? There's only a fraction of these things that get inspected. There is kind of a process by which they determine where they're going to inspect and what to inspect, but still, a fraction of these things are getting inspected every day. A lot of the wood boring things come in solid wood packing material as well, and also in solid plants. We get a lot of not just wood boring things that can bore into some of those bigger stems, but there's also a good bit of stuff that'll come over on leaves, a lot of the sap feeders and some of the aphids and scales and that type of thing. Once these things get here, they get moved around. You know, some of this stuff gets moved around on firewood. That's not my truck, just so we're all clear, but firewood is a major pathway for a lot of wood boring pests. In the southeast, we bale pine straw and we put that out in lieu of mulch. And you can see on this one, there's an invasive weed, Japanese climbing fern, wrapped up into that. So this thing gets wrapped up in wherever it may be, South Georgia, North Florida, and could get transported all the way up to Virginia or beyond. So weeds move around that way, just kind of by way of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Here you see Lomantria dispar. These moths are, you know, invasive moths all over the northeastern part of the country. These were on a trailer, I believe, that was going from Indiana down to Florida. Just happened to get stopped. I think they had a flat tire, and a person from the DNR stopped to help them and noticed this. The owner had no idea that things were even there. So just by, you know, serendipity, this thing was stopped on the way. And then honestly, the wind blows a lot of stuff around once it gets here. A lot of aphids and some of those smaller things, they get caught up in wind currents and they can get carried all over the place. Invasive plants is kind of a different ballgame altogether. Almost every invasive plant I can think of, with very few exceptions, got here on purpose because people bring them in for gardens. Why this happens is fairly simple. People make horrible decisions, right? At the time they thought, oh yeah, we'll bring that in, it's great. And then the thing gets out and we're in this world of hurt. We know when most of the woody invasives and even a lot of the non-woody invasives got here, we've got detailed records of people bringing it over for, a certain plant show or the World's Fair or something like that. We have records of when these things came over. They were initially planted as horticultural sections, horticultural selections, sorry, and then they go free. They either start producing seed that blows away or gets carried away by some sort of animal, or they just, are abandoned and they spread on their own. So why would someone bring an invasive plant over here? I think it's important to know that a lot of plants that were initially brought over here, they did not see them as invasive in their native land. Maybe they didn't behave that way, or maybe they kept them in, pots and it was very much a garden thing, so they didn't see they get out. But people brought them over for major reasons as a reminder of home. And I've got cookies here because when I was in college, I would go home every month or so and mom would make chocolate chip cookies and I would always bring them back because they reminded me of home. Another reason people bring stuff over is a business opportunity, right? Especially as this country was being colonized, there's a lot of people looking to make a buck and make a dollar, right? That's how we get some of these invasive plants. People thought they could sell them or sell some of the products from them. Once these non-native plants get over here, there's a lot of issues because they have a lot of the same characteristics. The horticultural plants have the same characteristics as invasive plants. Many were introduced as forages or as forages for cattle. Unfortunately, when you look at the characteristics of an ornamental grass and the characteristics of a forage, they're very, very similar. You've got, the ideal forage plant is easy to establish, lots of seed production, vigorous growth, rapid growth rate, high yield, insect and disease resistant. That basically describes the perfect invasive plant, right? Grows fast, produces a lot of progeny or seed, nothing likes to eat it, can reproduce easily. So unfortunately, those characteristics are very, very much the same. When these non-native things get over here and they take off, again, we mentioned they don't have a lot of their natural enemies, so not much eats them. This was just a survey done by this paper, almost 20 years ago now, but it shows very clearly that invasive plants have very, very little leaf damage, especially compared to the non-invasive or the native plants. Like stuff here has evolved to eat things that grow in North America. And when a plant species from Asia or India comes over, there's nothing that's evolved here to eat it, so nothing does eat it. Invasive plants also can adapt to new environments. So this is actually some data about loblolly pine, which is a very common pine tree in the southeastern US. Pines are native to the northern hemisphere. These data are from South America, where pine is invasive. Loblolly pine is invasive, and what this shows you is that in these more invasive populations, you have more leaf area on individuals, and you also have faster growth. So it's almost like the leading edge of the invasion front grows bigger and faster because there's some plasticity. There's some, each individual plant can change a little bit and adapt to those new resources. Invasive plants can produce a lot of seeds. This is some data from Ailanthus altissima, commonly known as tree of heaven. You can see that in this case, a 40-year-old tree can produce 10 million seeds. They actually measured all this stuff, right? And so what that means, if their seed viability, which they've also measured, is about 65%, that means that in each 40-year-old tree, in a 40-year-old tree, you're looking at 6.5 million viable seeds in their lifetime, which is just an incredible amount of seedling, seed propagule pressure going everywhere, right? Because then those things get blown around. This is just one invasive plant. There's lots of invasive plants that are very heavy seed producers, just like these. And then they're quick to establish in very disturbed areas. This is from Australia. Juncus is an invasive plant down there, and you can see this was just a washout area that was colonized quickly and thoroughly by this juncus, right? That reddish plant. They grow so thick that nothing else can get in there, and it's just completely taken over by the invasive. And then very hardy roots or rhizomes, and this just allows that invasive plant to withstand really, really harsh conditions. Maybe it's a drought where there's no water. It can just sort of go dormant and rely on those rhizomes and those root reserves to resprout again when conditions are right. Dense infestations is common with a lot of different invasive plants. This is Kogon grass from North Florida. All of that light green stuff is Kogon grass, and pretty much nothing else grows in a lot of these places because it grows so thick and so dense. And then also a wide tolerance to environmental conditions. Here's Phragmites up in New York, and you can see this stuff is growing practically into the road, into the concrete asphalt road. You're not going to see a lot of native plants growing in these harsh conditions, but you will see the invasive stuff because they're just a lot tougher and more adaptable than many of our natives. Allelopathie is where plants produce chemicals either in the leaves or in the roots that get into the soil and prevent the growth of competing plants. So this is an example for microstegium. They know that white snakeroot, I believe, has these allelopathic, so they grew that. That's the AGAL. So they know that can reduce that lettuce growth. And then they grew it next to Japanese tiltgrass and found the same thing. So that Japanese tiltgrass, that's one of the reasons it may. Is everybody there? I'm back.
Back, yeah.
That was weird. That was weird. Okay, so back in here. Sharing. There we go. All right, so they wait for that canopy gap to occur, and then they can aggressively take over those species. So we have this invasion curve with non-native species where, you know, there's a time that occurs after it initially gets to the new area. And we call that, you know, at some point there's that introduction point, right? The first individual or group of individuals gets into that area. And then as time goes on, you have more and more of these things growing. And then eventually we detect it. You see detection is next there. At that point, you can still eradicate this thing, right? But the trick is trying to actually find it and figure out that it's there. By the time a lot of people recognize it and public awareness happens, you're into that yellowish area where it's unlikely that you will eradicate that pest. It would take an intense effort, but usually it does not happen. And unfortunately, then it's after that, you're looking at just local management and local control. And there's not a lot you can do at that point except manage on a, like I said, a very local level. This is where I think county extension agents are, you know, they're so critical because you're on the front line for a lot of this invasive species detection. I would say more than likely you have the most, more interaction with stakeholders than most, if not all specialists. You have more time in the field than most specialists. You're out there dealing with clients, you're dealing with these folks, you're seeing a lot of stuff that we don't often get to see unless it's vicariously through you, through pictures, and you've got the better local on the ground connections. I'm a firm believer that if you need something done in a certain county, you go to that county's ag extension agent or natural resource extension agent, and they can help you get it done. So the next part of the talk will mix some case studies with what's going on with how the county agents are so crucial to the working of that. And first detection is one of the things, because like we just said, y'all are the ones that are out there day to day working with people, seeing the stuff. And a great example of first detection is the kudzu bug. So for those of you not in the southeastern US, kudzu bugs are these little things right here. They get all over kudzu. It's a type of stink bug. Their numbers are massive in the fall. They're very much a nuisance pest on homes and for homeowners, but they can also reduce kudzu growth. And there's also some, I think they're still working a little bit to see what's the impact potentially on soybean as well. But I think the awesome thing here is that when you look at the discovery and identification of kudzu bug in Georgia, it says right there, yada, yada, that county agents from Barrow, Jackson, and Gwinnett counties with the Georgia Cooperative Extension Service were the ones that first found this thing. So this is a very obvious case where the county extension agents found this new thing, brought it to officials, and boom, now we know it's here. Now we know what it is. And this happens in a lot more cases than just kudzu bug. This is just a really good, obvious example here. There's also range expansion where, where a lot of county agents are great contributors to this. And we'll talk a little bit about emerald ash borer now. This is arguably the worst, if not one of the, if not the worst forest invasive species in my lifetime, probably. The impacts are really tough to, tough to figure out, but it's safe to say it's killed millions of trees and cost billions of dollars across much of Eastern North America at this point, and it's still moving around. The life cycle for EAB, I think it's important we know this. They come out in late spring. They make these D-shaped exit holes where they chew their way out. Sometimes they'll come out just before leaf out, and the adults can survive a little bit without food. They do eat a little bit. They'll nibble a little bit on the foliage as they're mating. Damage by adults is basically negligible. It doesn't really do much at all. Then they lay these little eggs into the bark. You'll probably never see these unless you're specifically looking for them. They're pretty small. The big damage for this critter is done by the larvae. They feed on the phloem inside the bark, and they will completely girdle and cut off that tree's ability to move nutrients. The tree pretty much dies from starvation at that point. As these larvae are feeding, they will pack their galleries with frass. That's just a fancy entomology term for poop. And they pupate, and then they come out in the next year. So EAB is a really, really cool case study when we think about that invasion curve, right? There's always a lag time between when it got here, when the non-native got here, and when people found it. And this is a really good example. We know it came around Detroit, Michigan back in, I think, 2002 is when they first detected it. So someone went back, and Nate Siegert and his colleagues went back, and they sampled over 1,000, almost 1,100 trees in the area. And by taking tree rings, you can do dendrochronology. You can sort of recreate what happened and when they died. So he sampled a whole bunch of these in that initial area. And it provided a really good example of that invasion curve as it occurred, right? So what he found that was the oldest tree that died actually died from EAB in 1997. Okay, so this is when, if you remember that invasion curve, you've got that one point where it first started. That's where it started back in 1997. 98, 99, 2000, it grew. First detected it in 2002. And you can see how much damage, how much the damage area changed from 97 to 02. It took 5 years for us to actually detect emerald ash borer and to figure out it was even there, right? We didn't even have a clue it was there before then. And that is the point where it was detected. By that time, damage has been done. Public awareness, I would say, really happened in like 02, 03, 04. But by that point, your eradication is unlikely. There's just simply too much of the stuff out there to effectively eradicate it. Couple that with the fact that we knew very little about emerald ash borer because in its native range of China, it's not a pest. It just affected trees that were sick, dying. It was a secondary thing. They really didn't know a whole lot about it. So it's just one of those things where when you look at this invasion curve, you can then put some years on here, right? Introduced in 97, detected 5 years later. And then by the time public awareness really began in earnest, you're already unlikely to have eradication from this thing because that ship has just sailed. The populations are too high. They're too far. It would have taken a monumental effort at that point to basically remove ash trees in a 6-county area just to try to get this thing under control. Some of the signs of EAB are the declining and thinning crown. Those of you that live in areas with this thing have probably seen these all too much, I'm afraid. Unfortunately, the early infestation, signs just look like a sick tree. Maybe it's drought, maybe it's construction damage. It looks the same. But as that damage progresses, you get these epicormic sprouts at the bottom. This is a tree's last gasp breath and last gasp effort at life. And unfortunately, at this point, well, it's easy to handle this management-wise. You just make a single cut across the base because that tree's not going to die, and you talk about what you're going to put in there next. Up close on the tree, and this is all on ash trees, all fraxinus, you see cracks in the bark, and they'll kind of swell up a little bit. And if you look really closer, you will see the galleries going back and forth. Again, those D-shaped exit holes in those frass-packed galleries. And sometimes those galleries can be really, really extensive, just all over the inside of that bark. If you're driving by at 65 or whatever the legal speed limit is, of course, you might see an ash tree that looks like it's whitish. We call this ash blonding. This results from woodpeckers going after those larvae inside the tree. They're sort of flaking off that outer half of bark and leaving that whitish bark underneath. And so it gives that tree a very blondish look. And then to that extent, woodpeckers are a great indicator, right? They're a lot better at detecting trees with larvae than people are. And there's actually some work out of Minnesota that shows that if you focus on some of the woodpecker activity, you can find the EAB a lot sooner than any other method. Well, this green on this map shows the extent of where ash grows in the US, and the red dots all indicate where we have emerald ash borer. So you can see much of our ash range is already infested with emerald ash borer. And then this particular map shows the last, the blue counties are those that have been infested since from 2002 to 19. The purple and the green are the last couple of years, 2020 and 2021. And I show this because this is where county extension agents are so critical, because a lot of these new reports come with the help of agents, whether it's them finding these, these new trees themselves, or landowners going to them saying, hey, I have a problem. And then the agents being able to look at that tree and diagnose it. This is super important because we're still trying to track the spread of VAB to figure out where it's going next. Knowing where it is and where it's going helps these communities that are in the wake or in the forefront of it, helps them prepare, right? And some of these, at this point, we're just at a local management level. A lot of communities are trying to do removal and replacement of ash trees before EAB gets there, just to get rid of them and be done with it. You can save ash trees as well. There's lots of chemical methods that work quite well, but you have to catch it early. We sort of measure based on crown loss. If you have less than 10% crown loss, you've got a really good chance of saving that tree. If you've got between 10 and 30% crown loss, it's a little lower of a chance, but it's still probably pretty decent. And if you've got a tree that's already, over 30% thinning in the crown, I mean, never say never, but your odds are not good for saving that one, if we're being honest. And if EAB has done anything good, it's really helped improve our insecticide injection methods, right? We've got good soil stuff. We've got good injectable things for trees. Lots of different options you can do for single trees, right? You're not going to do this out in the woods, but if you've got, grandma's prized tree in the yard or something in front of the town square, you can save them, and you can save them even as EAB goes through. You just have to inject it every couple of years or annually as the pesticide recommends. In natural stands, it's a bit trickier, right? You're not going to inject pesticide into every ash tree in a stand in Ohio. We are working on some biocontrol agents. The USDA is working hard to see if there's some little wasps that are being evaluated and have been released to see how that will work. And then also stand manipulation on a large scale. And a lot of times stand manipulation is a fancy word for cut down the ash and get the value you can before it dies on its own. Now, EAB has been sort of a slow burn, and I mean that in the sense that EAB got out in 02. It was pretty much on its own by 04. I don't think anyone sensible believed we could ever eradicate it after that. And everyone else that didn't have it yet just sort of watched it creeping down and watched it come, and it's going to get pretty much everywhere, I do believe. And we've seen it coming. Right now you saw that map where it's kind of extending a couple counties, west or south every year. It's just kind of moving on through. ALB, or Asian longhorn beetle, is a lot different. This is another wood-boring invasive pest we have, and it's been in much more concentrated areas, the Northeast, Illinois, Ohio. And so this thing doesn't move like EAB. The biology is so different in that once it starts in a place, it tends to stay there for a while until it is usually moved by human means. So ALB is much different, especially here in South Carolina, because this one really hit us in the face. We were not expecting it. It hadn't really gone anywhere in a long time. And then all of a sudden, boom, here we are. Last May, Asian longhorn beetle was found in South Carolina. This is a native to Asia, again, very wide host range, though it does tend to prefer maples. Big beetle, you saw it in my hand here. This is, you know, it's 1.5 inches long or so. The antennae are about twice as long as the beetle. And so we know exactly where this thing is so far. This is the map from USDA APHIS. There's active populations here in South Carolina, Ohio, and then there's 2 up there in the Northeast. And on one level, it's surprising that this hasn't been found. You know, it took us 7 years to find this thing. You know, our dendrochronology told us that this has been in South Carolina since 2013. And so there's some issues there just with getting people to report stuff. But it's a big beetle. It'll chew these egg niches on the top of, or on the bark of trees, sorry, and then they look like little divots, basically. The female chews those, turns around, lays an egg in each one. In some cases, she just works her way up and down the tree and puts these egg niches in. Those eggs hatch. The eggs are about the size of a grain of rice, and the larvae burrow in, and they feed on the phloem early on. The tree responds by bleeding, usually, especially maples will kick out some really dark sap that sort of bleeds down the tree. And then as those larvae get larger, they turn and go straight into the tree and feed on the wood. That's when you see a lot of the sawdust kind of floating down everywhere, covering the cobwebs, covering the plants underneath it. And the big damage from these comes again from that larval feeding. This is what they do to the inside of the tree. They Swiss cheese the thing. The larvae are not small. As you can see, some of them can get to be almost the size of your pinky, and they create large holes going through that wood and through the stems. And this is sort of just the anatomy of the damage, right? It gets the oviposition pits down here. The larva feeds on the phloem, and then it turns in. You can usually, if you peel the bark away, you'll see where it just went straight in. Most of the feeding happens above where the egg was laid, and then the adults come out in a perfectly round hole above that. We do the pencil test because they come out from so deep inside the wood. You can usually stick a pencil in there, 1.5 inches or so. And the big issue here is these broken and falling branches, because if you notice, they don't consume a lot of phloem, so they're not like EAB where they're just completely taking away all that conductive tissue and all the ability for that tree to move nutrients. The tree can still move nutrients because each beetle just takes a little patch of phloem away, but this tunneling by the larvae really it weakens the structure, it weakens everything. So when there's a big wind, stuff just breaks and these branches fall. Here is that branch in my hand on the left, and if you look closely, here's all the different tunnel holes through that branch where it broke, right? So it just consumes all sorts of that stuff. And if you look up in some of these stands, there's branches kind of hanging everywhere. It's not the safest thing to be in. And you know, anytime we're working, if there's any wind ever picks up, we pretty much get out of there because you just can't trust it. The exit hole looks pretty much is about the same size as the egg niche. The adults do feed a little bit. They'll chew on some of those green epicormic shoots, but they don't eat a whole lot, and some don't eat at all. You can prevent it with insecticides. It doesn't work the best, but it is possible. Once a tree has it, there's no saving it. This is a federally regulated insect, and that tree is coming down. So we've been doing work on this since it came last year. We know that most of the trees infested are maple, acer species, mostly red maple down here, but it'll also infest cottonwood and elm, sycamore and birch as well. And so this is a big question we had is, how did this get here, right? If this is a bug that doesn't travel a whole lot on its own, it's not a strong flyer, it's known to stay in one general spot for years. How did it get to South Carolina from Ohio, right? The genetics tell us that this population matched Ohio. We know that is where it came from. How did it get from point A to point B? My first theory was it was put in by some spiteful Ohio State fan because they had not yet beat Clemson at the time, but we all know, or maybe we don't know, that last January they did finally beat Clemson. Congratulations to them, and that went great in the national title game. So it's probably not a spiteful fan because now we know it got here much, much sooner than that. Could be it got here from Asian longhorn beetle's native range, which is China and the Koreas. That's possible. We've got some ports in the area. It could have come from that same place in China. Could also have been from Europe. There's a lot of different ALB populations in Europe, so it could have came from that same spot in China to Europe and then to here. Any of those are possible. We've got 2 large ports in fairly close proximity to the infestation zone, which is down in Charleston County. But we also have a large RV park almost in the dead center of the infested area. Common to see RVs carrying firewood all over the place. There's a railroad that goes through. It's a very busy highway in terms of tourism. It pretty much checks every possible method that an invasive wood-boring pest could get introduced. My hunch is strongly that it was accidentally brought on firewood. It just makes the most sense. We know that visitors from Ohio are one of the most common visitors we have in the area. The College of Charleston does a lot of that research, and Ohio is always a top 10 state from where people visit. People bring firewood all the time. They might be driving a $250,000 camper, but there's 40 bucks worth of firewood on the back. It just makes the most sense to me that it accidentally came from Ohio. But that said, we don't know the origin. We probably never will know the origin of exactly how it got here. Frankly, it doesn't matter. It's here now and we have to deal with it. But is all hope lost? I would say it is not, right? Because every one of these green spots on that map is where ALB has been eradicated. You can get rid of those populations by simply removing all the trees. That's certainly a lot easier said than done, but our efforts are underway. You cut the tree down, you shove it through a chipper, and this kills all the insects inside there. Now, where the county agents come in is stakeholder education, right? Once we get within the state or even in the neighboring states, people need to know what to look for. This is a big beetle, and people need to know what to look for. And already we've got a lot of great county ag agents in neighboring states putting together materials, blog posts, giving talks. This is a crucial part of the whole, working with the landowners and getting the word out so that we can hopefully catch the next infestation before it gets very large. There's also spotted lanternfly. This has made some big news the last few years. This is, again, native to Asia, first found in Pennsylvania in 2014. Fairly good sized thing. You see it here on my hand, and then also that's the adult on the right. The youngsters, the nymphs, do not have wings, but they are black, white, and bright red. Very easy to see. Here's your current distribution for spotted lanternfly. Unfortunately, that blip on northern Ohio just appeared last week. That's right up by Cleveland. And earlier this year, populations were found in Indiana. Long story short, this thing is getting moved around. It is not a strong flyer. It is a very capable hitchhiker, and that is very likely how this thing is moving around. If you look on that map, you'll see a lot of counties have red dots in them. That is where some individual egg mass or nymph or adult has been found, but there's no infestation. So this just shows that it gets moved around, and it doesn't always establish. In some cases, it was a dead one that was moved around. Now, that said, the potential distribution of SLF is pretty big, right? Especially across the middle of the country. There's a lot of areas where there's very suitable habitat, and this is by host plants. It feeds on over 100 host plants that we know of. Climate is right, so it's certainly not that there's not a lot of places where it could expand. It just hasn't yet, and it likely will. Life cycle is a fairly standard plant hopper life cycle. The adult lays those eggs on the left, and the egg masses are tough to find. They look like a piece of silly putty someone pressed onto a rock or a tree stem or something. Very tough to see. The nymphs initially are black and white only, and as they get older, just before they turn adults, they get that bright red on them. So it's very easy to see these things. They're very distinct. There's been some work done, and the public is very good at identifying these because they're so distinct and obvious what they are. Bees have a strong preference for tree of heaven, which is another invasive plant. They tend to congregate on it, and in some cases, people have used tree of heaven as a trap tree. So you can get rid of all sorts of trees, tree of heavens, and leave one kind of in the middle of an area, and they will all go to it. You can then treat that thing with insecticide and kill, hundreds of them at a time. County agents are critical to containing SLF. You notice I had eradicating last time. That ship has sailed. We're not going to eradicate spotted lanternfly. At this point, we're managing it, right? It's too far up that invasion curve, barring some sort of airborne microbial thing that wipes it all out, like some sort of, disease for spotted lanternflies. We're not going to ever get rid of it. This is going to be here, and it's going to be managed on a local level. And a lot of different extension agents are doing that already. Here's one from Cornell, from New York. They've got the mapping apps, and they're helping people. If you think you see it, report it here. Virginia is doing a lot of landowner education as well. And then of course, Pennsylvania, which is kind of the hot spot. They're the go-to for a lot of this spotted lanternfly stuff. Their county agents are writing all sorts of things, helping growers, especially the wine growers, figure out what can you spray, what can you use to still try to get something out of your crop and get rid of those lanternfly populations. Agents are critical in ongoing management of stuff, right? And we've talked about insects and that type of thing today, but wild hogs are a massive, massive problem across much of the country, even up into Canada. Here's a great example of a program started by one of the county agents in Texas, the Wild Pig Abatement Program. This was started by Ms. Jessica Rimo, and it's a program that is run by residents, facilitated through extension over there, Texas A&M AgriLife, and it hosts hunts and other reduction activities for wild hogs. And it looks like they've been quite successful in keeping those populations at bay. And with wild hogs, that's all you can do. They're extremely hard to eradicate. They're very smart. They reproduce like crazy. So keeping them at bay is the local management. That's basically what you can do. So there's a lot of really good examples out there. This is just one I happened to read up on. And then multi-agency collaboration. That was one of the things that we wanted to talk about. And none of this stuff happens in a silo or on an island, right? A lot of activities by county agents are part of a larger program, just like a lot of activities by specialists are part of these larger programs. Take a couple here, the Asian giant hornet out in the Pacific Northwest. Major programs by the Washington State Department of Ag, Washington State University, and of course, USDA APHIS, all have gone together. They have gone to great lengths. They have, found nests. They have equipped some of these wasps with radio transmitters. They're big enough to where you can do that. And that is how they have found and eradicated those wasps. It's a really, really great success story so far. We hope they've gotten all of them, but it's an ongoing thing, right? So people are, every summer now, it seems like extension agents across the country are putting out, this is an Asian giant hornet. These are the large, big, yellow, stingy things we already have, and trying to help people decipher what is what. Asian longhorn beetle is no different. It's a multi, it takes a village down here between extension, who are doing all the education for folks. Our regulatory services do a lot of the delineation and then working closely with APHIS and our Forestry Commission to help protect our forest resources. So this is a great big thing we have to do to try to get this whole program running. And each of these pests, each state has a program for it. We have a major program for this. There's a major giant hornet program out in Washington, and it takes a lot of people to keep these things running. And then states that, that maybe aren't the epicenter, but certainly have these pests, like Maryland. You've got a good spotted lanternfly program right there as well, with the Department of Ag and Extension and APHIS too. I mean, everything's trying at this point to contain these things and manage on a local level. We didn't even get into invasive plants because, good Lord, we could be here all day, but suffice to say, there's still plenty of them out there. Here's a paper that shows there's plenty of invasive plants that are still being sold all the time, whether it's online, in stores. Invasive plants are incredibly easy to buy, which is very unfortunate. It's also unfortunate that many folks out there, many of our stakeholders don't realize what is and is not invasive. And that sort of falls on us to help educate them. Well, here's a lot of native things you can do. We do a lot of that down here. Plant this, not that type of scenario. And this is where a lot of the county ag agents come into play, because you've got that connection with the local landowner. And it's really your voice that they will listen to over someone from main campus a lot of times, if we're being completely honest. And I just want, before we end, I want to just mention how critical the county agents are. I know there are some specialists and maybe even other faculty out there that don't appreciate what y'all do. And I just want you to know that a lot of what happens and a lot of what we do does not happen without the folks in the individual counties. They're absolutely crucial to us figuring out what research questions need to happen. We work with a lot of them. And I just, I've heard some county agents say in the past, I'm just a county agent. I don't ever want to hear anyone say that, because you're not just a county agent, you are a county agent. And the importance that you have to the whole system is just astronomical. So that being said, I'm happy to take any questions on any of this stuff. And that's what I've got. So
Anybody got questions for Dave?
see a couple in the chat here. Let's see what we got. Okay, no questions. Yeah, happy to take questions on any of the invasive stuff.
Well, I'll just say, Dave, you kind of hit across this. Just because you ain't find it in your area doesn't mean it's not there. Sometimes these things are cryptic, and it takes a while before you find them,
Yeah, that was what we learned with, Longhorn Beetle. It had been there 7 years. And when we first went to that neighborhood where it was found last summer, we had, Clemson people and USDA people and all that. We're all there looking at all these trees, and a lot of the residents would drive by and say, "Hey, what are y'all doing?" And we say, "Oh, we're looking for these beetles." Tell them a little bit about it, and they would say, "Oh yeah, those are the ones that come to the lights at night, and those are the ones we see in the swimming pool." People had known about them and they'd seen them for years prior. They just didn't think to say anything about it because they didn't know it was anything out of the ordinary. So, it was a real, I guess, reality check for us. Like, wow, and I know you're not going to reach everybody, but it was sad to hear that, unfortunately, that they'd been there that long and people knew.
Yeah, there's not a lot of public awareness, but I can say for an agent, what I will say is this murdered hornet business, and I think that a lot of people would concur with me, that we've been getting called. I mean, I get here, I'm outside of Atlanta, Georgia, and I've been fielding a couple dozen calls over the past weeks about, "Oh, I found a murder hornet in mine. I need to report it." Well, it's not. It's a cicada killer wasp or European hornet. And I think in some ways the media has kind of overblown, and people are thinking that's everywhere when it's not. It's not really being explained to people.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and I'll be honest, to the untrained eye, anything big and yellow and black looks like a massive, they all look the same to a lot of people, right? And it takes some effort to get people to see, well, does it have a big head? And a lot of times like, I don't know, I didn't get close enough to it. I just know it was 1.5 inches long. And there's challenges for sure.
Any other questions for Dave? I think, let's see, the chat box, you might have some. Good presentation. There's some compliments, and I concur. Anybody else got comments or questions you want to ask Dave?
I'm happy to have anyone reach out offline if they're shy. And I'm happy to, answer anything you folks may have wonders about.
Yeah, well, David, we certainly appreciate you coming out here, taking time to give us this very informative presentation, and appreciate all the help you given us and everything. So, again, thank you from all of us, and we look forward to hearing your next presentation sometime soon.
Happy to do it. Take care, everybody.
All right.